Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design. Hey everyone, this is Ariel. I'm here on my own right now because today we are switching things up and we're going to do it a little bit differently. Usually, Peter DeWitt is our phenomenal podcast host, and he is such an experienced interviewer and wonderful speaker. So I usually let him do the hard work of talking to people and asking the questions, and he does such a fantastic job with that. But he has a book just out a couple weeks ago called Collective Leader Efficacy. And so we wanted to switch things up, and I convinced him to get in the hot seat. So today we have a little bit of a different thing. I'm going to be interviewing him, and you don't often, get to hear on this podcast a lot about Peter's work. That's why I'm so excited that today we get to dive into Collective Leader Efficacy, which is the work that he is really passionate about. And I've been working with him on this book for over a year and a half, and it's just such a pleasure to see it finally come to life and to share it with you all today. So here we go. I hope you enjoy this interview with Peter DeWitt. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Ariel, how are you?
Good. I'm so excited that we're switching roles today and you get to sit in the hot seat.
It's a little bit nerve-wracking. I'm used to having all the control over what we're going to talk about. So,
Yeah, you gotta let go of that.
Yes, I guess I will have to.
Well, congratulations on the release of Collective Leader Efficacy. Just came out a couple weeks ago. Really exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's it's always it's a little daunting when you're writing the book, and then it's even more daunting after it comes out because you're like,
right. I
like it. I really hope everybody else does too.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that they will and that they do. And so let's talk about that a little bit. We talked with Jenny Donahue and Megan Shannon Moran in season 1 about collective efficacy. So I feel like we have a pretty good grounding and understanding in what collective efficacy is. But I really want to know, what inspired you to write this book, and what does collective efficacy look like for leaders in particular?
Yeah, I think, obviously I'm a huge fan of Jenny's, and she's a very good friend, and also Megan. I mean, I cite Megan all the time. So every time I meet her, I feel like I'm meeting a rock star. The thing that was always interesting to me is, just for me, it was about, I remember when John Hattie released the research about collective teacher efficacy, and, he sent me all the research and all that stuff. So I started to look at it in collaborative leadership and school climate, and then in instructional leadership as well. But one of the things, and you and I talked about it when I was writing instructional leadership, I think one of the things that made me start to wonder about what is the leader's role is the idea that every time collective teacher efficacy in the research comes up, it was always about teachers getting together, really important. But the leader's job was to set up this opportunity for teachers to collaborate, also very important. But what I always think about being a school principal, I was a school principal for 8 years, is that I want the role to be more than that, than just setting up a dynamic for other people. Because the reality is we have to do formal observations, we have to do walkthroughs and learning walks, we have to, have faculty meetings and all those kind of things, all those things that I've been talking about for years. I felt like when we talk about collective leader efficacy, the reason why I wanted to write and talk about collective leader efficacy is because I wanted the leader's role to be more impactful. I wanted to be, and I started to think about where would this happen? And every school leader has a shared decision-making team. They call them shared decision-making. They call them building level teams. They call them instructional leadership teams. So I really started to look and say, so collective leader efficacy is about when the principal is definitely involved. And what that means is that it's also, there's going to be that status issue that's going to be an issue. Because when the principal's involved, then there's almost this unwritten rule that the principal is going to be the one to set the meeting and set the direction and everything else. And I wanted to say, how do we get the principal to lower their status and raise the status of the people around them? Collective leader efficacy is still that shared conviction that we can have an impact on student achievement and student growth. The reality is it gets a little bit tougher when you involve a principal, because the principal is another layer away from being directly in that classroom with those students. So I wanted to be able to really dig down into how can we do this and why should we be doing this? Like, why is this so important? And I think for me, one of the most important reasons to actually define and talk about collective leader efficacy is the fact that the principal is always sort of on the outside looking in. And I wanted to be the principal to be right there at the table, not controlling the conversation, but being a part of a greater conversation with the people also who are around the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So what I hear you saying is that it's about that belief and fostering that belief in a school's instructional leadership team around their impact, their potential to positively impact student learning. And there's an inherent challenge in that maybe a group of teachers wouldn't face, because in a group of teachers, there's not necessarily that hierarchy. However, when you have an instructional leadership team, you're going to have that hierarchy, and that's going to cause some inherent maybe tension or challenges or power dynamics that you have to overcome in order to accomplish collective leader efficacy.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of work in coaching over the past years, and when I've coached school leadership teams, it was always interesting to me to sort of sit down and nobody would talk. And if I asked a question, nobody would talk until the principal talked. And you would always I watch for body language. I mean, from running workshops and everything else, you watch body language, and people they wouldn't speak until the principal started speaking. And I was thinking, I wonder if we could change that dynamic. And then I remember being in a school district not too far away from me. And one of the things that happened is I was questioning the principal on some of their biggest issues. One was they had a huge tardiness issue, that an absentee rate that was very high. And it was one of the things that I needed to talk about. And the principal seemed like he was on the defensive. And I was trying not to do that. Like, I tried to do a better job of that. But he said, well, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this, we're doing that. And then he actually got up to take a phone call and said, I have to go. And left me there with the rest of the team. And one of his assistant principals, after he left, looked at me and said, I just want you to know we're not doing any of what he just said we're doing. And I'm like,
oh my goodness.
Okay. And that happens a lot. You've got these teams that get together, and there were teams that I worked with that had teachers and instructional coaches, everything, that were sitting around the table and they didn't even know why they were there. And I remember feeling baffled by that. But then I started thinking, when I was a brand new teacher, I was the only teacher on our building level team, the BLT, and I knew I didn't have a voice. I was there as window dressing. My principal wanted me there to say, no, we've got teachers on board, but I didn't speak. And I kept thinking, wow, that was 1997. Like, you would think. And that has not always changed. And so when I started looking and doing the research that because we've been talking about it for a year and a half, I would start talking about like drivers and drivers for change and drivers for improvement, because I'm obviously Michael Fullen's been a mentor. And a lot of the teams were saying, we don't do that. We don't do that. Or cycles of inquiry. We don't do that. What do you do? We get together once a month. And you also see a lot of overlap between, you've got the instructional leadership team, you've got a school climate team, and it was just, if teachers and principals are burned out, because that's what research is showing us, then maybe what we need to be able to do is look at what we can de-implement. And that's a part of the collective leader efficacy process too. Thankfully for, John Hattie, who introduced me to that as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned those drivers, and I know when you first started writing the book, we talked a lot about what should we call those? They were first conditions. We had, a very complicated graph that we were trying to figure out. So, but I feel like it's boiled down to a pretty solid, good concept now, which is these 8 drivers. So can you kind of walk through what those 8 drivers are?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to thank you because, you have you have this stuff in your head that you're trying to put out. And as you know, I like to put an image together first and try to unpack it that way. And you're like, well, you were asking these great questions. So for those prospective authors out there, you need good editors who are going to help you be able to, work all this out. But yeah, it was actually Ken Leathwood. I sent him the book for feedback, and he gave me some really incredible feedback, and he started calling them drivers. And I was like, oh, I was talking about drivers in the book, so this is a good thing. And then of course, Michael Folan wrote the foreword. So there were these drivers that were around for a while. I mean, the collective leader efficacy research is fairly new. It's only been around for a decade or so. And Ken Leathwood is probably the preeminent person who has looked at it. And so he has talked about things like working conditions and context beliefs. And I think those are very important. So those are 2 that I was definitely going to make sure that I had as drivers. But one of the things Leathwood asked me was, why did you bring in new ones and not use all of the ones that are out there? And it was a really great question. And I did it because of the fact that I think it's important to really look at the sign of our times. We've been through COVID. I was paying attention to research from NASSP and EPI that showed that something like 42% of principals who were surveyed said that they wanted to leave their position. And I've written blogs on mental health that have done extremely well. So these are issues. So when I started looking at drivers behind a team, I focused on mindset. You and I are big Carol Dweck fans. I interviewed Carol on a seat at the table for Ed Week. So mindset was something that I wanted to look at because I kept hearing all this stuff about deficit mindsets and COVID learning loss. So mindset was definitely going to be one. Well-being was going to be the next one, because I feel like if we're going to talk about workload, if we're going to talk about mental health, then we have to talk about our well-being and what we can do differently as far as a team goes or individuals within our school, whether that be, schedule when we check our emails or, understand how we talk to one another, those kind of things. Then go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love how that also dovetails with Bandura saying that our physiological states impact our efficacy beliefs, right? Yeah. So that goes hand in hand. Our mental health and our well-being is going to have an impact on our efficacy beliefs around our impact as a team too. So
yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because you actually raised a really good point that I forgot about, which is it was really important, and Leathwood said this to me as well in the feedback, to make sure that each one of these, and Jenny Donahue had talked to me about it too, make sure that each one of these sort of quote unquote new drivers that I'm introducing are tied to Bandura's 4 areas, which is,
yes.
Challenging, mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and affective states. And so I wanted to make sure that I did that, and well-being definitely ties into that for sure. And then with mastery experiences and vicarious experiences, that's why I added in another driver, which was professional learning and development. And I actually looked at Andy Hargraves and Michael Folan for that, because they wrote a really great paper for Learning Forward, who also we know is co-publishing the book, but they wrote a great paper for Learning Forward probably about 3 years ago that said that professional learning is a lot like student learning, where we're looking at outcomes. Professional development is where we're developing, mindfulness and team building. So we need that to be a driver for what we do as a team, because if we're going to talk to teachers about how they need to change strategies in their classroom, then we need to be modeling what that looks like as well as a team, and how are we learning together. And as you know, I put in the book, there are different roles that people can play on the team as well. And one of those is that of a researcher or even a facilitator of learning, because if learning is going to be the core belief in what we do, then that's something that we need to focus on. Then there are other drivers like, working conditions, context beliefs. Do we actually believe that we work in a school district that's going to support us when we're trying to be innovative? And Ed Week Research Center has done some really interesting research about that, to say that principals feel like they're being supportive, but teachers are telling us that they're not. So you've got like a high percentage of principals that say, of course I support my teachers when they want to be innovative, but it's showing a low percentage of teachers that say, of course my principal, supports us when we're trying to be innovative.
Yeah.
And then there were a couple that I got from John Hattie, and John obviously has always been very good to me. But in there, he was looking with Doug and Nancy about collective student efficacy. So he started talking to me about skills to work in collectives. And I looked at it from a different vantage point. I sort of took the idea and then went in a different direction. And for me, skills to work in collectives is how we communicate. It's about social sensitivity. Do we understand how people are receiving our messages? But it's also about that whole idea of psychological safety. Like, when we're having these skills to work in collectives, have we fostered this place where we can be psychologically safe, where we can challenge the thinking of the people around the table? And that's why it's so important for principals to lower their status and raise the status of the people around them, because very often you don't want to argue with the guy or the woman who is, the person in charge, right? You have a hard time doing that. So skills to work in collectives are about how those principals can actually lower their status and raise the status of the people around. And then the last is what it all leads to, which is confidence to work in collectives. And that's where I actually talked more about Bandura's research behind mastery experiences and vicarious experiences and those kind of things. So those are the 8 drivers. And when I'm working with school leadership teams, because this is my work for the next year or longer, when I'm working with school leadership teams, we're focusing on a cycle of inquiry, but at the same time, we're focusing on a couple of those drivers at the same time to talk about, so what does your well-being look like? Well-being is the starting point for every conversation, for every coaching session that I have. Let's talk about that first, and then we can move into, maybe it's the skills to work in collectives or the confidence to work in collectives. So they're all really interrelated. I just wanted to be able to tease them out as well.
Yeah. So this cycle of inquiry is kind of the place where this work happens. It's the process that you go through to build up these 8 drivers that lead to collective efficacy. And then the goal ultimately is to impact the instructional core, right? So that's kind of what it's all leading towards, is the instructional core. So can you explain about the instructional core and kind of what that is and how collective leader efficacy impacts that?
Yeah, so instructional core really comes from the work of Richard Elmore, who sadly passed away a few months ago. And Elmore's work has always been deeply impactful. But when he wrote and I cited the paper in the book, but he wrote a paper about breaking up the cartel of school leadership programs. And it was very in your face, but I appreciated it very, very much. And he talked about the fact that we very rarely talk about our instructional core. And the instructional core really comes down to how teachers are actually prepared, to not only instructional strategies, but the fact that our teachers really prepared to try different instructional strategies and understand their impact on learning. And then one of the other pieces of the instructional core was also this idea of students taking ownership over their own learning, and making sure that we've got content that is actually offers the opportunity for students to really go deep within their own learning. And that is the piece about the instructional core that I think is really important, because it's definitely about making sure that we are understanding how teachers are actually engaged in their practices, but also how students are engaged in their own learning, and then making sure that we've got content that is actually very supportive of that journey as well. So that's the instructional core. And he's absolutely right, because it goes back to what I was saying earlier. So often, I remember John Hattie wrote a paper. It was the first paper he actually asked me to edit, and it was in 2014, The Politics of Distraction. I remember he sent me the rough draft and asked me for my feedback, which was an intimidating experience. And in there, I will never forget, he wrote, it's too often in schools we talk about the adults, we don't talk enough about learning. And that's true. That's what happens around the table as well. I'm going to be working with a few school districts that they actually said, we never talk about this. We never talk about this stuff. We never talk about learning. In fact, I did a workshop this summer in Wisconsin, and I always check in on people when I'm going around from table to table. And this one superintendent, she looked at me and I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I'm having a no shoot moment." And the actual word. And I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry." And she goes, No, it's just that," she said, "I realized we never talk about this." She said, "We have leadership teams and we never talk about this." And I'm having this moment where I'm like, I have some work to do. And I said, "Okay, we've got a starting point." Like, it was really good. And I ended up meeting up with her later on at a dinner, and she was fantastic, but she was so brutally honest. She said, "We just haven't been having these conversations, and I want to change it around." And that's all I want. Like, that's what I want. I want people to talk about learning, because I feel like we can be, all of us, including me, I feel like we can be much more impactful in what we're doing when it comes to student learning.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny how sometimes we just forget about the ultimate, impact and the purpose of why we're here. We get so caught up in what we're doing every day, we forget what it's all for.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned Elmore and his leadership development paper that was so eye-opening and kind of in your face. And so that has me, wondering about collective leader efficacy and what role collective leader efficacy could play in better preparing our leaders. Because if what's broken is our leadership development system, how could CLE play a role in fixing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I do a lot of work in Australia, and I'm on an advisory board for Victoria, which is like Melbourne and the surrounding area. And I had a conference call with a couple of people from there last night, and we were talking about exactly this. And the reality for me is, I went into my principalship as a learner. I go into running workshops and coaching as a learner. I don't feel like I know it all. And in fact, I just read a really great book that you would love from Adam Grant called Think Again. And he was actually saying, the more confident you feel, the less you probably actually know about a topic. And I was like, oh my gosh, self-efficacy. And he was talking about there's a difference between confidence and competence, which is stuff we've talked about in the past. Yep. I think that step one is that we have to allow new leaders to be in a space where they don't feel like they need to know it all. That's hard. I'm a control freak. I'm a perfectionist. That's hard, but I still want to go into a situation as a learner. So that's something. Collective leader efficacy is all about how we learn together at the table. The guy that I was talking to last night, we were actually talking about the fact that we both didn't like the words lead learner. And I realize that to some people it's going to be a little controversial because they call themselves lead learner, but I want to explain, I don't like it because it makes it seem like the school building leader is always the one in control. And I feel like, how can we develop language where we're all in control? I get the buck stops with me, I'm the school principal and all that stuff. But the reality for me is, if we're really going to have people feel like they have this collective responsibility, which is something I talk about in the book, then what we have to be able to do is get new principals and veteran principals to be able to walk into situations more as a learner than as the person in control, and start to go through that cycle of inquiry where they can really tell where is that challenge area. Because especially for new leaders, there is this insane pressure to go in and have to change something. Like, you have to show your strength because you're a new principal, you have to change something. And the reality is, in doing that, you can really hurt your school climate. So this is more along the lines of, for new school leaders and veteran school leaders to go in as a learner and then be able to say, where do we need to develop our understanding of where our focus needs to be, instead of always jumping too quickly into something that might not be impactful. And this is the last thing I'll say where this is concerned. There's some amazing research. You actually introduced it to me. There's a meta-analysis on coaching, right? From MetaX that you sent me. And that research was pretty eye-opening because what it showed, and you and I talked about this offline, what it showed is that instructional coaches have like a 0.68 effect size when it comes to getting teachers to change strategies in the classroom, which is over the 0.40, a year's worth of growth for a year's input. But when it comes to actually impacting student learning, it's a 0.18. And I remember you asked me, you were like, how does this happen? Like, how do you have a point? How can you change a strategy and yet it doesn't impact student learning? And I've thought a lot about that since we had that conversation. And just because you change a strategy, just because you flip your faculty meeting, doesn't mean it's going to be any more impactful to student learning. So they go hand in hand, right? So we have to, when we're going into this as leaders and we go in as learners, merely changing a strategy isn't going to be enough. It's about how do we collect this evidence to understand the impact that we're actually having? And there's a lot of tension in there that we need to focus on. And that's where collective leader efficacy comes from, because in that process, that's where you build that shared conviction.
Yeah. I love that. And I hear you saying that collective leader efficacy and kind of removing that hierarchical structure isn't just good for the students and for the teachers. It's also good for the leader in so many ways. So that kind of brings me to my last question for you, which is, what's at risk? What's kind of the fallout if we don't make collective leader efficacy a priority? I mean, maybe we're already seeing it. Maybe schools are already kind of suffering and they don't realize that collective leader efficacy could actually solve a lot of these problems that they're facing. But I just want to hear from you kind of, what's the risk if we don't pay attention to this?
Well, the risk is that we seem to be on a fast-moving train toward burnout. And I think that going through the process, especially with the newer research that John sent me when it comes to de-implementation, something that I've been focusing on more and more lately, is that we really have to look at our practices and understand which ones that might need a partial reduction, which ones just need to get taken off the plate altogether. So through that process, we can do that. And maybe we can save ourselves from some of that burnout. I think what's at risk if we're not doing it is that the principal, once again, is just like left outside. You know what I mean? They're seen as they went to the dark side. They're seen as the one that left the classroom, as opposed to being really into the conversation and learning with everybody else. I think what's at risk is the fact that we won't be able to go deeper with student learning. We're always just going to hear that, oh, we do that in pockets, because I feel like as a workshop facilitator, when you ask who's doing this kind of work, it always comes out, oh, we're doing this in pockets. So it's really about not doing it in pockets anymore. It's about making sure that this is like across the board with our whole entire school climate. But I will say there's a risk that you probably didn't think about. And it's a negative risk toward collective leader efficacy. And it's actually pressure that I felt when I was a school principal. Sometimes your district office wants you to be collaborative until they think you're being too collaborative and teachers are walking all over you, which is not necessarily what's happening. It's just that if we're going to be collaborative, then we need to understand that teachers are going to have a voice. And sometimes collective leader efficacy can be viewed from an outside, like the district outside, as, well, those principals are just giving teachers too much voice. And that can be a risk of collective leader efficacy. And in those situations, you really have to be open and honest about what collective leader efficacy is, and the fact that allowing teachers to have a voice, encouraging them to have a voice, and fostering that voice is actually good for the whole school community. It's not this power play of who's in charge.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good realistic perspective to have. If you're going to take on this work, and you should, it's worth it. Just be ready that there might be some pushback in some ways.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I've loved working with you on this book. So, Peter, because we don't spend a whole lot of time, hearing from you about, we're always talking about other people's accolades and, their work and everything, which is great. Where can people find out more about your work and more about Collective Leader Efficacy if they want to go deeper with it?
They can go to my website. So just search for petermdewitt.com. They can go there, and there's definitely stuff there. You can go to the Corwin website and just search Peter DeWitt, and you'll get information there as well. Those would probably be the two primary places to find out more for me. And I would be remiss to not say that not only have I loved working on this book with you, Ariel, I have enjoyed working on every book that I've written with you and creating a couple of great book series over our time together. And I am deeply going to miss you because you are a fantastic editor who has gotten me to think differently, because you ask such great questions that you often are a catalyst for me trying to think differently about something, because what I think is in my head and what you see might be two totally different things. And you've always had such you masterfully can get writers to do that. And I will be forever grateful for our time that we worked together.
Thank you, Peter. Same here. I've really, really enjoyed it. I want to make sure that people know about your fantastic newsletter that you started recently.
Also because of you.
And your online courses too. So if people want to learn more about Collective Leader Efficacy and go kind of beyond the book, obviously you should read the book. But if you want to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, if you go to my website, you will find out more about the Collective Conversations newsletter that I send out once a month, which is the idea that you had. And it's been great because we're creating a community. And then, I created, thanks to Julie Stern, she inspired the idea. I actually created Thinkific courses. So I had a couple of 8-week courses, and then I created a year-long on-demand asynchronous coaching course. And we meet up probably every 3 weeks for what I call a mastery class. We do a mastery class for an hour where we focus on content from either instructional coaching or leadership coaching. And we've created a community of learners, and you can start it at any time, and you get, I actually give you access for 13 months. So,
okay.
You get a month for free.
Ooh, that's a great deal. All right. Well, thanks so much, Peter. Really excited about your book, and we'll be back next week. You'll be back in the interviewer's seat.
I will.
I hope I did an okay job stepping in this week. But thanks. All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks, Ariel.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Peter. I had so much fun being in the interviewer seat and getting to talk to my dear friend and collaborator and thought partner, Peter DeWitt. And it was so interesting, I think, to hear about, what's the risk of not doing Collective Leader Efficacy and not making that a priority, but also what's the risk of doing it? I thought that was a fascinating point that Peter brought up. So I hope that you all learned something from this, and I hope that you can take this and bring these ideas back to your school leadership teams and implement them right away. And all of the links and references that we talked about in this podcast episode, we'll make sure those are on our website, corwin.com. If you go to corwin.com/leaderscoachingleaders, you'll find the show notes for today. Again, catch us on YouTube if you want to just watch a video version of this. And don't forget to leave us a review. We'll see you next week.